All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight. I know that there are competitors for your activities tonight, and we appreciate you coming to this second event of our Billy Graham Symposium. As many of you know, this marks what would have been Billy Graham's 100th birthday, and so when we were thinking about the sorts of people we would want to have come speak, of course, Grant Wacker was one of at the top of our list, and I'm Tommy Kidd, by the way. I'm the Associate Director of Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, and I'm also a professor in the History Department here at Baylor. If you're not familiar with the Institute, we're an interdisciplinary institute on campus that fosters the study of religion across the disciplines, sociology, history, philosophy, epidemiology. We do a lot of different topics in the study of religion. And we also host events like this that are of broad public importance and interest. And obviously something like Billy Graham's 100th birthday is a big one. And so I appreciate Byron Johnson, Director of ISR, who makes events like this possible, and also for Todd Still at Truist Seminary for hosting us in this lovely facility. I do want to introduce Grant Wacker. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with his work, but he is a mentor to many of us, either formally for the Duke students who are here and work at Baylor, who were his students, and then people like me who have just gained so much from knowing his work and knowing him for some years. He's a mentor and an example to a lot of us of a Christian scholar. His formal title is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus of Christian History at Duke Divinity School. And Dr. Wacker is one of the leading scholars of our generation on the history of American Christianity. He's the author or editor of many books, including Heaven Below, Early Pentecostals and American Culture, 2001, Harvard University Press. America's Pastor, Billy Graham and the Shaping of a Nation, 2014, Harvard University Press. And he is one of the co-editors of the recent Oxford University Press volume, Billy Graham, American Pilgrim. And I know that they have some copies of those books for sale out in the narthex. And he's going to talk tonight about Billy Graham, humility and ambition in the formation of an evangelical titan. Grant.
Thank you, Tommy. It is a great privilege to be here. A room hosts many friends, and some friends from long standing, so thank you a lot. And as Tommy said, I know that there are some competitor events going on out there, and many people would like to be home watching television tonight. What's going on, if you're looking at your cell phones, I understand. I might be doing the same actually along the way, so you understand. But we'll try to be. I'll try to finish up before 11 p.m. So you can catch the late night returns. And thank you, of course, to the Baylor organizer and the Institute for putting this symposium together. And I do not want to embarrass Elisha Kaufman, but I am free to do it anyway, and thank Elisha in particular for all of her hard work and for inviting me to come. Thank you, Elisha. Graham's day has passed, as I'm sure all of you know. He died February 21, age 99 and a half. And so now is a perfect time in many ways to stand back and assess his legacy and try to understand who he was and how he has influenced evangelicals, how he has influenced the Christian and religious landscape in America. And so this is the right time, but this is also an invigorating setting because many of the people who have studied Graham, in many contexts, are right here tonight. And it's more than a little intimidating to see Bill Martin sitting here, but I'll do my best, Bill, to stumble along. When I see so many Graham scholars, and Bill, it does remind me of an occasion that took place many years ago. One of my daughters was 10 years old or so at the time, and I came down the steps of our house carrying a satchel one morning, and she was sitting at the breakfast table, and she said, "Are you going somewhere?" And I realized that I had forgotten to tell her that I was going on a trip, and I said, "Yeah, I am. Sorry, I'll be gone a couple days." "Where are you going, Papa?" "Well, I'm going to California." "What are you going to do in California?" "Yeah, I'm going to give a talk." And she said, "Well, what are you going to talk about?" And I was more inquisitive than a 10-year-old normally is, and so I thought, well, it's a serious question. I'll give it a serious answer. And I said, "I'm going to talk about religion and politics." Pause. And she said, "How long are you going to talk?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes. Long pause. "Papa, do you know that much?" And that's the way I feel here tonight. Do I know that much? Do I know enough to really, occupy this time with all these Graham scholars here? But I'll give it a shot anyway. In the twilight of Graham's long life, observers kept asking, and Bill Martin's apt words, what manner of man was he? And that was not a question about specific successes or specific failures, the kind of question of failures and successes that you might tally up on a column, but rather it was a question about character, the abiding dispositions that governed his life. And tonight, I wish to suggest, not exactly argue, that's too strong, but to suggest that one ingredient in Graham's titanic standing on the American and to a significant extent the world Christian landscape was the perennial interaction of two seemingly inconsistent traits, ambition and humility, in his life and career. Now, the exact configuration of ambition and humility can take a number of forms. We can imagine, we can think of it as an energizing tension. We can think of that as a kind of fruitful result of the coupling of opposites. There are a lot of ways to imagine these trends coming together. I'm not so much worried about the metaphorical structure here, but the key point is that ambition and humility appeared throughout his life and very often at the same time. And these ingredients happened at the same time. We have to talk about them sequentially, but they were constantly present. Let's begin with ambition. Figuring out what ambition is tricky. Like many words in the English language, ambition connotes different and not entirely consistent meanings. Sometimes it suggests a kind of unseemly desire to get ahead. Other times it suggests disciplined hard work. Two authoritative dictionaries capture these different connotations. Merriam-Webster defines ambition as an ardent desire for rank, fame, or power. On the other hand, the Oxford English Dictionary defines ambition as a strong desire to achieve success. These are not entirely, but quite different meanings of the word. We might simplify matters and simply call these two forms of ambition bad ambition and good ambition, and I think we see both in Graham. In Graham's career, bad ambition took various forms, but most of them seem to boil down to self-aggrandizement. Now, to be clear, I see no evidence of material self-aggrandizement. He lived comfortably, but never opulently. And I see no evidence of self-aggrandizement at the expense of other people. By all accounts, he was kind to others without exception. But self-aggrandizement as a quest for self-satisfaction, or to put it bluntly, as the enhancement of his ego, abounds in the evidence. What is the evidence? Well, to begin with, Graham was a terrible name dropper. Even his closest friends and admirers, even his family, admitted this trait. Name dropping was for Graham a form of credentialing. Sometimes his very identity seemed to lie in the people he knew. Some defenders tried to explain the trait or explain it away by saying that he was just insecure about having grown up on a farm, or that he didn't come from old money, or that he did not go to a prestige college, or that he did not go on to seminary. Well, he did go to Wheaton, which was a prestige college within the evangelical world, but initially not in a prestige college. It's hard to make this line of explanation, that is, insecurity, work, because Graham actually rubbed shoulders with many of the richest, most powerful, and most elite people in the nation and the world. I suggest that sometimes it's more persuasive simply to accept a trait for what it was, in this case a fault, and say that he was a terrible name dropper. Beyond name dropping, Graham loved to bask in the limelight of his friendships with the rich and the powerful. From the 1950s through the 1990s, his photo routinely appeared in leading newspapers and magazines with government officials and entertainment celebrities and business celebrities. He was always there, front and center. Now, there was never a hint of personal impropriety in any of this coverage, but there was also never a hint that he felt the slightest reluctance to enjoy the glory of other people's fame. And there are plenty of times that Graham evidently enjoyed his own renown. We like to see his name front and center. In the 1954 London Crusade, for example, he was anxious about attendance, and he told one of the organizers, "I do not see my picture up on billboards enough." He liked to see his image front and center, too. If you travel to the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association archives in Charlotte, the headquarter archives, you will find that they house more than 1.1 million negatives of photos of Graham. Now, and I've spent days there looking at them, and the majority, most of them are photos taken by journalists of public events. But there's a fair number, and I would guess thousands of photos of Graham posing for photos. If I may be allowed the term in this chapel, he was incredibly damn handsome, and he knew it. And he posed. Historian Michael Hamilton limned the paradox of Graham's basking in the limelight precisely. Mike said he was a genuinely humble person who spent his long life drawing public attention to himself. And he even saw the paradox in himself. He said, "Pride is an insidious thing. I've never quite known whether I was proud or humble." Closely related to name dropping and basking in the limelight was Graham's readiness to speak in public beyond his knowledge. Reporters asked his views about things great and small, and he routinely told them. One biographer, Marshall Frady, rightly noted Graham's habit of, as Frady put it, ceaseless, extemporaneous, free-form punditry on topics as varied as the culture of the Congo, the common market, and the utility of bomb shelters. Now, part of the problem, and Elisha has written wonderfully about this, about journalists, part of the problem lay with the journalists who constantly plied him with questions that they knew he didn't know much about. But they kept asking, and he responded. They wanted to sell newspapers, and Graham could not resist the temptation to respond. And finally, I would say he was oblivious to others' deeper worldviews. Now here you have to be careful. By all accounts, he was a very careful listener in person to students and question and answer sessions. He listened, stories abound, Graham listening to people tell their whole life story when they're sitting next to him on a plane, pouring out their heart, and he listened, and he asked questions. He would capture their names, and if he saw them later, he would say, "How is this grandchild?" And he would know their names. He listened to people. He was a good listener. But what he did not do is inquire about people's deeper worldviews. I see no evidence of Graham interrogating Buddhists about the rewards of their faith, or secularists the reasons for their position, or those who had left evangelical Christianity as to why they had chosen to go another way. When it came to religious worldview conversations, Graham was almost always, if not always, on the giving end of the conversation. All this to say is that Billy Graham was not the simple varnished mannequin that emerges in the BGEA websites. He was a real person, and there were cracks in the marble statue with reference to ambition. That's the bad ambition. Now I want to talk about the good ambition. First off, hard work. I've learned this from Bill's volumes. Hard work, plain old-fashioned hard work, launched the list. Now, Graham had a lot of help along the way from very fine associates and from efficient employees, and above all, from his multi-talented wife, Ruth. Even so, he could not have sustained thousands of public speaking engagements, authorized uncounted printed words, surely in the millions, and orchestrated a far-flung global evangelistic empire for more than 6 decades without intense and sustained labor. And when you think about it, much of this is quantifiable. Stadium records, organizations launched, books written or authorized, movies he stood behind, electronic media, Hour of Decision, radio, television, Christianity Today, Decision Magazine, My Answer daily newspaper column. It goes on and on and on. That couldn't have happened without massive, sustained hard work. Yet by any reasonable measure of such things, and certainly if we had asked him himself what his hard work had produced, his answer would have been instantaneous. And he would have said, 3 million decisions for Christ. He saw that as his signal accomplishment. 3 million decision cards turned in. He never qualified that statement. Besides hard work lay another kind of ambition character trait, and I would call it charisma. Now, to be sure, the ingredients of charisma were inherited through the genes, they were nurtured on his mother's knee, and they were fostered by the favorable circumstances of his upbringing. And yet, this is the key point, Graham chose to use his charisma, however naturally he came about it. He chose to use it not for personal gain. He could have gone into enormously lucrative sidelines, but he used it consistently to further his evangelistic work. I'll offer just a potpourri of comments about Graham's charisma, and I think it makes the point about the power that he had at his disposal, which he used in a consistent way for his evangelistic work. Famed country singer Barbara Mandrell, I don't often quote Barbara Mandrell, but here is an instance. She said that she knew only 2 people in her life who took over a room when they walked in, and they were Billy Graham and Johnny Cash. Another manifestation, the kind of charisma we're talking about that he had at his disposal, was a businessman once wrote Graham and offered him $100 a minute if Graham would just sit down and talk. One more, Sam Hill, who many of you know, who's the dean of Southern religious historians, once told me, he said, I would not walk across the street to listen to Billy preach, but I would walk a mile in the snow just to have a short conversation with him about anything. These kinds of anecdotes could go on, but we get the point of what he had available and how he used it in a disciplined way. A third manifestation of good ambition is personal probity. Ambition to do the right thing. Though the press exaggerated the number of evangelists who strayed, the number was always great enough to keep the fires of suspicion burning brightly, and Graham looked strong in contrast, and not least because his commitments to personal probity persisted decade after decade. We heard this morning from Ed Stetzer about the Modesto Manifesto, which incidentally, Graham himself never used that term, and neither did Cliff Barrows or Bev Shea. This is a creation of the media, but it stuck. And we know about this Modesto Manifesto, about the 4 traps that they would avoid and what they would substitute: financial integrity, marital chastity, truthfulness, and cooperation. And these traits became so strongly associated with Graham's ministry that they eventually acquired the label, the Graham Rules. He never used that term, but others did. By 2018, these rules had grown so famous that a fictional Netflix episode prompted one American journalist, actually from the Washington Post, to call me up and quiz me. In the scene, you may remember this, in the scene, Queen Elizabeth II, who was Queen of England, invited Graham to Windsor Palace to talk about the theology of forgiveness. And so as it's depicted, Graham seated himself on a couch in this cavernous stateroom to talk about the theology of forgiveness. But it was just the Queen and Graham in this cavernous stateroom. So the reporter called me and said, did Graham violate his own principle about never being alone in a room with a woman? The point here is that Graham's personal probity had become so set in the public mind that it exceeded even the common sense boundaries he had envisaged. And finally, a final manifestation, what I would say positive ambition, is his ability to serve as something like a public moral gyroscope for 6 decades. He spoke with authority across the years. The burning issues of the day paraded past him, one after another, and then disappeared. Yet his voice remained, somehow seeming to transcend it all. In the words of Christianity Today editor Ted Olson, it's one thing to be quick with a quote, but it's something more to command the moral respect that inspired enthusiasm for the entire second half of the 20th century. Graham knew that hitching his wagon to the star of partisan and culture war shibboleths, instead of focusing on truths that remained generation after generation. Now, to be sure, knowing the danger is not always the same as avoiding it. Sometimes he fell off the wagon, but to a remarkable extent, he succeeded, especially in his later years. Let me turn now to the second broad impulse, humility. Humility is even more slippery than ambition. And if we look at standard dictionary definitions, we get it again. Oxford English Dictionary. Humility is the quality of having a modest or low view of one's importance. Not so good. Merriam-Webster defines humility as a freedom from pride or arrogance. So here again, we find this tension in these words, humility. In this word, humility. In actual practice, on the ground, humility proves even more elusive and complex than these dictionary definitions intimate. You can't seek it. Humility crumbles as soon as you seek it. One of my friends, many of you know Lori Maffley Kipp, and she was teasing me about this whole project, and she said, I know what you need to do. You need to write a book and call it Humility, a Memoir. Okay, you see the problem. You can't seek it. And humility is very rarely a permanent acquisition. It flickers, it comes and goes. Like the giant puka in Mary Harvey's wonderful children book. It is here, there, everywhere, nowhere. Humility is always, or almost always, riven with irony. Graham's adroit use of self-deprecating humor would not have worked unless it came with a clear awareness on his part of his own fame. So, a lot of complications in figuring out what humility is. Even so, whatever it is, and we'll get more precise about that, it's pretty clear that Graham possessed it. And he possessed it in great measure. Now, just like ambition has good and bad forms, I think humility has good and bad forms, and I want to start with bad humility. And bad humility might be called meekness. And in Graham's case, meekness morphed into timidity in the face of some problematic social norms, especially with reference to women and race and poverty and militarism and political partisanship. Now, it's important to stress that in most respects, not quite all, but in most respects, this timidity yielded to a bold witness for social justice as Graham matured. But these very early postures cannot be expunged from the record, and they're the ones that hostile journalists and historians continued to remember. And I would suggest that when he died, you see this, and that most of the eulogies were positive, but there were some that were just searing, and usually the searing ones go back to what they perceived as Graham's early timidity in the face of different kinds of injustice. He grew out of it, but that didn't erase the problem. A second problematic form of humility was his willingness to dim his critical judgment in the interest of personal loyalty. And this trait characterized his relationship with several presidents, and most notably Richard Nixon. His dogged support of Nixon during Vietnam and Watergate persisted long after most Americans had abandoned Nixon. I propose that obsequiousness to Nixon offers the best interpretation of Graham's scandalous remarks about Jews in the media that took place in Nixon's office in 1972. Usually this toxic event is portrayed as anti-Semitism. I don't think it was that at all. There's no trace of anti-Semitism anywhere else in his life. What it reveals, I think, is this was an instance, another instance, or extreme instance, of his compliance with the glitz and glamour of the presidency in general, and a fawning relationship with Richard Nixon in particular. This is humility not working. But there was a good humility. And this is what drew me to study Billy many years ago, and what still draws me to the man. Positive humility loomed tall in his life and his career, and virtually all journalists and historians who countered him talked about it. They used different words. Sometimes they talked about sincerity or authenticity or earnestness or guilelessness, but they usually meant pretty much the same thing. Time reporters Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy represented many. They spent hours with him in his home, talking with him, and when they left, they said his sincerity was like paint stripper. Even the ones who didn't like him who wrote negative biographies like Marshall Frady's. They usually started off by talking about this trait of just this extraordinary personal humility that came across in different ways as sincerity or guilelessness, authenticity, earnestness. So where did Graham's humility really lie? What do I think it consisted of? And this is the heart of what I want to talk about tonight, and I will watch my time because I want to leave time for questions. I want to hear what you think. I think that the heart of Graham's humility, positive humility, lay in 4 places. The first was his willingness to face up to his mistakes. The second was his habit of self-forgetfulness. The third were his feelings of gratitude for the gifts that he had received. And the fourth was unflagging obedience to calling. Let me take them in order. I'll speak briefly. First, his willingness to face up to his mistakes. Blunders scarred his record, and he knew it, and he apologized for them. When he died, eulogists repeatedly remarked on Graham's willingness to come forward and openly, candidly discuss his missteps and regrets, and he often brought it up first. If you've ever looked at his memoir, you'd be interested to see that in the very first page of the very first chapter, he starts by talking about his egregious blunder when he interviewed Harry Truman. And Truman never forgave him. To the end of Truman's life, the relationship was frosty. Graham never tried to defend his own mistake and how he handled that interview. The short of it is that he went out and blabbed to reporters about what Truman said, and Truman was furious. Graham apologized innumerable times for political partisanship, for spending too much time away from his family, for not spending enough time reading and studying, for accepting too many invitations to speak, for declining to speak about the Vietnam War, for failing to address racism more forcefully, for failing to march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, for slandering Jews, for allowing himself to be suckered by Nixon. He even apologized for watching too much television. Apologies for mistakes and failures were not just general expressions of remorse, but they very often took specific focus. It's easy to say, well, I'm sorry, I wasn't all that great of a father. He was very specific. We don't have time to talk about tonight, although I can. He was very specific in naming the places where he felt he had gone wrong, where he had failed himself, failed his family, failed the church, and failed God. British journalist David Frost once asked Graham if he had questions he hoped to ask God when he got to heaven. Yes, thousands, Graham said. Some of the things in my life I would be embarrassed if anyone else saw. I would like God to edit the film. I find that pretty powerful. Self-forgetfulness. The second form of positive humility. Self-forgetfulness followed this willingness publicly to apologize. Again and again, we see him keeping himself in the background, giving credit to others, especially to his associates. He showed very little inclination to exercise power outside his own organization. He formed no denominations such as Amy Semple McPherson's International Church of the Foursquare Gospel. He formed no college such as Oral Roberts University. He formed no media empire such as Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcast Network. He formed no philanthropy such as Franklin Graham's Samaritan Purse. He formed no megachurch such as T.D. Jakes' Potter's House. He did not seek to institutionalize his memory. Observers repeatedly noted Graham's ability to discipline, not erase, but to discipline the temptations of ego. One said to me, Billy could not have done what he did without ego, but he knew how to put a governor on it. aides reported that he demanded that they critique his sermons. And when they didn't do it, when they said, "Oh, that was just a great sermon," they got a tart response. He said, "You know it wasn't a great sermon. You tell me what I did wrong." Ever haunted by the fear of failing himself, failing God, he fervently hoped never to stumble or take credit from the Lord for what the Lord alone had done. Associates uniformly spoke of the words he uttered over and over: "I'm just a spectator watching what God is doing." So self-forgetfulness. The third was gratitude. Gratitude flowed from public apologies and from self-forgetfulness, and that was the third form of humility. From beginning to end, Graham showed awareness of unmerited grace infusing his life. When people asked him, as they often did, "Why so much attention has fallen on you?" he invariably responded the same way: "I have no idea." The first thing he planned to ask the Lord when he got to heaven, he said, was why the Lord had chosen an ordinary farm kid from North Carolina to preach the gospel to millions around the world. And of course, gratitude to Ruth, not only for standing by him for more than 6 decades of marriage, but also for helping to prepare his talks, for critique of his sermons, for keeping him away from politics with mixed success, for taking the lion's share of responsibility for rearing their 5 children. At the time of Graham's death, the Washington Post columnist Michael Gerson, a Wheaton graduate, Michael Gerson was not uncritical of Graham in other places, but at the time of Graham's death, Michael wrote, "For Graham, faith was not the instrument to some other end. It was the prize itself. He had no ulterior motives, no trace of cynicism. He was consumed by grace and spoke in gratitude." And finally, obedience to calling. Ironically, it's not exactly clear when Graham concluded that a general calling to Christian service was a calling to become an evangelist. We don't really know. He wasn't clear about that. It was probably while he was with Youth for Christ as a young man. But in any event, whenever it happened, at some point, he grew certain that God had summoned him for this particular line of work and no other. He said his life was not his own to do with as he pleased. It's very important to add to this sense of calling something else, and that is confidence that God had given him the ability to do the job that God had called him to do. And I want to stress that because we often forget that. It wasn't just a sense of calling and that I can't do anything else, but rather God has enabled me to do what he has called me to do. He never minimized, let alone disparaged, his accomplishments. That would have minimized the magnitude of the work that God had accomplished through him. Forgive a personal story. My wife and I had the privilege of visiting him 4 times. And he was getting on in years. He was in his 90s. And the first time we met him, his assistant, whom some of you know, John Akers, said, "Billy Grant is writing a book about you." And he said, "Why?" Well, that took me back. I wasn't expecting that. And I said, "Well, you've done some important things." He said, "No, the Lord has done important things through me." Now, I've thought about that statement a lot. He did not deny that he had done important things. I think if someone had said that to me, most of us, our response would be, "Aw, shucks, not really." He didn't say that at all. He acknowledged that he had done important things. But those important things had come through divine enablement. Here, Graham exemplified the words of the 1930s Olympic track star Eric Liddell. "I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel God's pleasure. Graham left little doubt that he too felt pleasure in obeying God's calling. Another one of Graham's biographers, David Aikman, captured this determined obedience to calling with the conviction that God had enabled him to fulfill that calling in a great way. The way David Aikman put it was, Graham's great achievement was not how he handled failure, but how he handled success. I'll conclude. Those are always the sweetest words at any talk, right? I conclude, okay. Graham's status on the Mount Rushmore of American religious history is secure. The challenge for us as historians is to figure out how he got there, how he stayed there so long, why millions loved him, and why thousands hated him. Tonight I have proposed a possible explanation. Certainly not the only explanation, but one that seems to account for a lot of the evidence. Often we think ambition and humility are contradictory impulses, and maybe they are in some ways on paper. But in Graham's life, they seem to function as, in fact, an energizing friction, a life-giving union of opposites. In these days of bitter division in the culture, and often enough in the churches too, the model of Graham's personal life may be as helpful as anything he ever said in the pulpit. He certainly was not an angel, if by angel we mean someone who made no mistakes in his ministry. He did, and some of them were grievous. But he was a saint, if by saint we mean someone whose life showed the humility of honest regret, self-forgetfulness, gratefulness, and obedience to calling. Graham knew that the world was filled with personal and social brokenness, and he tried to do something about it. He walked the talk, and in the process, he exemplified the making of an evangelical titan. Well, thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and Zach is going to bring up a microphone or two. And if you could go to the microphone when you want to ask your questions, and then we can, people can hear it, and also we can capture it for the film. That would be great. So come on up.
Okay. I'd love to hear what you think. Well, maybe I wouldn't actually, but I would. I would, because I want to keep thinking about this question of the intersection and invigorating interaction of ambition and humility. So I cherish your ideas. I might be able to use them. We have to take turns, okay? All right, Barry, good man. I knew I could trust a historian to come to the rescue.
This is that cheap shot unfair thing when you ask about something related to what you talk about.
Okay.
But Billy seemed to learn from his political mistakes.
Yeah.
Any idea why it seems that Franklin has not?
Whoa. How long do we have? I gave a talk in Boone, and actually it was at the YMCA, and so I don't know what the constituency actually was, but there were a lot of people there from Samaritan's Purse, and someone asked that question, and that exact question, and Barry was channeling that question, and someone in the audience said, it's because Franklin was Ruth's son, not Billy's. Now, I want Ann to reflect on this certainly tomorrow, but I think that there probably is in Franklin more of a harder edge that we see in Ruth, and Ann knows far more about this. But insofar as I know Ruth, is I think that Franklin, I mean, I'm not suggesting any kind of genetic transfer here, but I am suggesting that there may have been dispositions to take very strong stands and not budge. But as to why Franklin could not really, or does not really, aspire to his father's inclusiveness, this is a mystery. I mean, people are mysterious at the end of the day. And all I would simply say is that I think the senior Graham's ministry was marked by an increasing desire for inclusiveness. He did not want to alienate people needlessly before they heard the gospel. Bring them in. No need to alienate them and send them away until you've had a chance to tell them what you want to tell them. And therefore, he also avoided the cultural wars. I also think that temperamentally, he was fundamentally irenic, and he wanted to be liked. And that I could, include in some of these character traits. He very much wanted to be liked. He did not like to alienate people in general. One of his associates said that he was in many ways like a pillow cushion. He bore the imprint of the last person he talked with. And that wasn't because he was weak-minded, but although I've suggested that, there are times when he was, overly influenced by others. But I think it's because of a desire to be liked and then to use that disposition to further his evangelistic purposes. It's a tough question, Barry, And people, ask that question a lot, and I don't know, the answer. Elisha is going to ask a question that will challenge me.
It will, and it's got nothing to do with Franklin. You noted that Graham didn't build an empire legacy for himself the way like 700 Club or a university, but there is the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. So how and why for you is that categorically different than these other things?
Right. And I expected that someone would ask that. And there is no answer in the sense that I cannot say the BGEA is entirely different from these other possibilities, but I would say that the BGEA is only one of many possible institutionalizations. John T. MacArthur, of the John T. MacArthur fellowships, for example, offered to fund a Billy Graham University, and Graham would not take that. And he had so many opportunities, to institutionalize his legacy in other ways. But there's another answer, I think, to Elisha's question, and that is, though he did in fact create the BGEA, I think he did it primarily and initially to institutionalize and regularize accounting procedures and to deal with the IRS. And from that, then, it grew into something much larger. Beyond that, and this is the real heart of my response, is that Graham never turned the BGEA into an organization that would perpetuate his own legacy. Franklin claims that, for sure. I don't see Graham himself that he ever really, maybe at the very end, but in the years of his active ministry, I don't see that he sought really to perpetuate himself to the BGA or anything else. Near the end of his career, a reporter did ask him, will there be another Billy Graham? And predictably, he answered with a quip, and he said, no, you've already had too much of me. But then the reporter pressed, and then he went on to say, he said, oh yeah, there will be another Billy Graham. He said, in fact, there will be tens of thousands of them. And he said, they will be pedaling bicycles through jungle trails, carrying the gospel. So the way he saw himself is, yeah, there'll be Grahams, other Grahams, but that he will transmit his legacy not through one towering figure like himself. You know, he understood who he was. See, that's part of the paradox of the man. He understood who he was. He knew his power, but he didn't see that power should be or would be perpetuated through another figure. True, toward the end, Franklin came over and Billy endorsed Franklin's role, but this did not happen until very late in his career. That's not a perfect answer, but I mean, it's a good question. Not a perfect answer, but I think it is an answer. And I would stand that with the claim that on the whole, he did not find ways to perpetuate his ministry in some really firm, conspicuous way. Well, we talked earlier today. What is your name?
Joshua Sharp, sir.
Joshua, and you told me you probably wouldn't come tonight. You would be watching the Lady Bears, right?
That's not what I said. That
No.
was Dylan.
Oh, your friend said that. Okay.
Yeah, I care more about God stuff than sports.
I understand. Okay. There you go. Yeah,
So-
yeah.
I'm remembering a story from the 1970s when John Stott had sort of a confrontation with Billy Graham about Graham's stance on the relationship between evangelism and social action.
Mm-hmm.
And because John Stott was confrontational and put his foot down, Billy Graham was quite compliant, as you mentioned. So in the broad scope of his ministry, were there any areas or instances where you think Graham's compliance may actually have had significant positive impact both for his own ministry and for other people that he was affecting?
Yeah, great question. Well, Alistair, where are you, Alistair? Did you make us tonight? Yeah, Alistair knows far more about the Graham-John Stott relationship than I do. When Alistair talks tomorrow, I may have some comments on it, but that's not the heart of your question right now. And the heart is, did he yield? That's a wonderful question. Did he reluctantly, as I understand it, did he reluctantly, or maybe even half-heartedly, yield, and then it worked out very positively? And yeah, I think there are instances, and one case, I mean, it's a negative example, but it still makes the point in a way, in that he actually had many invitations to take up academic posts, and he declined them because he said, I'm not an academic and I'm not an administrator. He knew his gifts. Now that's in a sense the reverse of the question you're asking, but it was a response to an invitation that prompted him to define himself. Who am I and what am I good at? I'll digress a second to say he was pastor of a little church in Western Springs, Illinois, and Ed Stetzer mentioned that this morning. And after 18 months, he left it. He recognized that this was not where his gift lay, and the church recognized that too. I mean, they were ready for him to go, and he was ready to go. So he had to develop his own identity, and that often came in response to other people's reaction to him. I mean, he heard what people were saying. I can't think offhand of an instance where he resisted, but in the end, well, in the very beginning, he did not. And Bill, you can correct me on this. I think that in the very beginning, he was not eager even to form the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, but he recognized that he had to do this for IRS reasons. And so he set up a Portland crusade. He needed, I think, $25,000 to get it going, and that also was to launch the Hour of Decision. Now, there's a good example. Okay, to launch the Hour of Decision radio broadcast, he needed another $25,000 to raise the money to do that. And so he put it out, as they said, as a fleece. Well, yeah, I don't know this, but in my heart of hearts, I think he pretty much assumed nobody was going to come across the 25,000, and so he was off the hook. Huh? But lo and behold, somebody gave him the 25,000, and so he had to do it. That's a really good question, and you prompted me to think more. But he certainly was very responsive over the years to conversations with people that helped him define himself and know what he wanted to do. You know, I've been thinking also primarily of Graham as an American, and I'd have to think about this in the international context as well. Maybe Uda can comment on that tomorrow, or Helen. Were there times in his international ministry where these conversations drew him into a kind of ministry that he otherwise might not have assumed? Yeah, these are really good questions. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Was that a hand that was going up, or no, or just a twitch? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Baylor, for having this symposium.
Yeah.
I'm Ken Dove. I'm a pastor of the Church of Nazarene out in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia. And I had a privilege of meeting Dr. Graham a few times, and I was an evangelist at the time, and he wanted to know what affiliation, and I told him Church of Nazarene, and a big smile came across his face. Of course, Chuck Templeton was a Nazarene. And he said, "Oh, you Nazarenes, you have the answer, you just don't live it."
He said that? Yeah.
He said that. And then the next year, I saw him in Tampa right before a crusade, and he saw me, and he came to me, and he said, "Ken, how's the meetings?" I couldn't believe that he would remember me, just one meeting and probably 5 minutes of conversation.
Yeah.
But I wrote my dissertation about him just a few years ago. And what gripped me was, I believe, the sense of how God formed a team together and how all that came together. Like George Beverly Shea, he kind of busted in his office and asked him to be a part of a radio program that Torrey Johnson gave him there while he was pastoring in Chicago, and became the voice. And then how he met Cliff Barrows. He was on his honeymoon. They needed
Barrows
a song.
was on his honeymoon. Yeah.
And needed a song leader, and he said, "Come on, Cliff, we won't be choosy." And how the team just formed together, and also the timing of Graham in history, right after World War II, and his message, very anti-communism in those earlier days, you know, and it's about Randolph Hearst, who somehow, whether he showed up in L.A. or not under the Canvas Cathedral, we don't know, but that Puff Graham, that has become legend, and how he became known through Life and Time and all the magazines happening. He also used the mediums of the day. You mentioned radio. And then 1957, New York was the first crusade televised on ABC television on Saturday nights, and did that for months. He used television greatly. He was invited on shows like Jack Parr Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Jack Benny, the BGA showed me this film clip of him. Jack Benny gives Dr. Graham the last 3.5 minutes of the show to kind of give a sermonette, and that would be unheard of in this day. He was on Hee Haw. He was on Laugh-In. He did all these television shows. And
Woody Allen.
The question that I have there is, you mentioned earlier.
Also Walter Cronkite.
And
You see Hee Haw and Walter Cronkite. Okay?
Right. Do you believe that, I have my own assessment of this, but do you believe that there was a part of Graham to be on television was really something, or do you believe that he also found that it was also another means to get the gospel out? Was it a mixture of both?
Sure.
So,
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, it goes to what I was talking about earlier, and we could use other terms than ambition and humility, but they would come to the same thing, in that he loved being in the spotlight. He loved seeing himself, in the spotlight. He loved being on Woody Allen, and if you watch that, you can see it on YouTube. Now, I mean, he is utterly relaxed. He is trading barbs with Woody Allen. He's getting the better of the barbs. I mean, everybody's laughing. He's laughing. You can tell the man is enormously enjoying himself, and he's extremely good at it, and I see absolutely nothing wrong with that. He was just good at what he did. But he also invariably used those occasions to further his evangelistic aims. I have never seen any hint that he ever fell into smutty jokes, or in any way there were no double entendres whatsoever. And as far as I have ever seen, that that they just don't exist. So yeah, he used the media. He enjoyed it, and as I said, I mean, I was just struck when I was looking at the photo archives by, I didn't quantify them, the hundreds and hundreds, surely maybe thousands of pictures where he is just posing. Well, I'd pose too if I looked like that. I mean, he's just, a stunningly handsome, attractive man, and all of the newspapers. I mean, when he died, it was very interesting to look at the eulogies and how many of the eulogies commented on his good looks. And a perfect example is Newsweek. The first line of the eulogy in Newsweek was, "His face was Hollywood handsome." Okay, as I said, he knew that, and there's nothing wrong with knowing that, but he also used it. He used it for his evangelistic purposes, and did it adroitly. Actually, Grady Wilson made a very fine comment about this. Someone asked Grady Wilson if, or the extent, or how it was the case that Graham's handsomeness was involved in his evangelism. And so the reporter said, what if Graham had been born short, pudgy, and scrappy of hair? And Grady Wilson said, but he wasn't, was he? And the organization understood how there is a media presence to accomplish these goals. Personal enjoyment, sure. Personal satisfaction, sure. But larger goals are also at stake. I mean, isn't that true? Most of us who are teachers, I mean, we get gratification from classes, students who learn. I mean, it's all a very, very gratifying process, but we're also pretty convinced, I think, that somehow we're furthering understanding of history, if we're historians, understanding the church, furthering, the gospel, that these things work together. That's part of it. The big bucks is another part of it that we all get, of course, the really, really big bucks. But aside from that, these things flow together. They're really good questions, yeah. Hi, Regina. Good to see you. Regina was one of my victims back at Duke. And she came tonight anyway. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you how you see the humility and ambition expressing itself in Graham's preaching and kind of preaching style, and that being adopted by other people. How did he view that? And in that particular arena, how did those two things coincide?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive question, and I really would have to think about that because I haven't thought about it, and maybe just offhand, he was very funny in the preaching, and when I go back and I look at those old tapes, I'm struck by how funny he was. And the 4 times that my wife and I visited him, this was one of our compelling memories, is how funny and the one-liners. Well, he was a master of self-deprecating humor, and there was just so much of it, and some of it I've gotten out of my own research, some of it from Bill, some of it from Elisha's work, and but he was. He was so good at this, and just a couple of examples. He'd tell the story. He loved to tell this story. He did it over and over. He's on an elevator in Philadelphia, and a man gets on the elevator and looks him up and down, and the man said, "You're Billy Graham." And Graham says, "Yeah." And the man says, "What a disappointment." Well, Graham loved to tell that story, and it always evoked, laughter. Another one he loved to tell was he's sitting in a restaurant in Asheville, and a woman comes up to him at his table and says, "You look exactly like Billy Graham." And he said, "Yeah, people often say that." He wanted to be able to have dinner, without, and another one, the one that I especially like, is he's in the Miami airport, and he's coming through the Miami airport again. A woman rushes up to him and says, "I know who you are." Oh, he stands there. And so she says, "Will you sign this piece of paper?" And so, okay. And so she puts a pad out there, and she said, "Just write James Arness." And he would go on and on, with stories of this sort. Now, they worked because he also knew that he was famous and he had enormous accomplishments. They worked because he knew he was Billy Graham. It wouldn't work for me, You have to be aware of who you are in order to deploy self-deprecating humor effectively. And I think that's an example of how he was able to use his status, again, though, for these larger purposes that I brought. I'd have to think more about that, but it's a wonderful question, Regina. Yeah, I'm sure there are additional, there's so many Graham scholars here, and, I'd love to hear anything more you would like to comment on this, yeah.
Thank you, Grant. A question born of grave ignorance. As you are reflecting on Graham and humility and ambition, I'm curious, were there any historical inspirations for him, people that he kept on coming back to as people that he was modeling his life, his ministry, his career after?
Yeah, he wasn't much of a historian, as we know from listening to his sermons. He used history. Well, we all use history, right? But he was not a historian in any serious sense, although he did read biographies. And he said that, and one of his associates, some of you know, John Aker, said he was a very serious reader of serious biographies. So he did read history in that sense. But he was not a serious historian. But, so he did not set himself up in a historical tradition in any self-consciously critical way as many of us would do here. But he did invoke persons of the past, and the one that recurs most frequently by my reading is Moody. Now, we could do a word search because his sermons have now been digitized, and it would be really interesting to do a word search on this. But not having done a word search, my strong sense is that he looked to Moody far more often than anyone else. To my knowledge, he never referenced Amy McPherson. He very rarely referenced Billy Sunday. And people ask, and I think Sunday was too bombastic. Sunday was too political, and Graham didn't want to go that way. Moody, on the other hand, apolitical. Now I know you can argue that, well, if you're apolitical, you're actually political, but in a kind of obvious way, Moody was largely apolitical, and he was very focused on one purpose, the purpose of proclaiming the gospel. He had a clear sense of purpose, a clear sense of what he was doing. And I think that's part of what Graham saw in Moody. And then Moody was also irenic. And Graham, I'm sure, liked that part of Moody. Expansive, irenic, apolitical, inclusive, focused on the gospel. There's a lot about Moody. And he was not an academic. I mean, his sermons are simple. They were profound, but they were simple. Moody was a master of making simple sermons profound. Or you could say profound things. You know, I've never thought about that until just a second. I mean, Graham was a master of taking profound concepts and uttering them simply. And I think Moody did that too. So there are a lot of people you might think that he would invoke that he didn't. He once preached one of Jonathan Edwards' sermons, word for word, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He ran out of sermons in Los Angeles Crusade, and so he just holus bolus borrowed Edwards' sermon. And he acknowledged it. He told people what he was doing, but in that sense, he drew on someone of the past. I don't know of him actually using one of Chrysostom's sermons or St. Ignatius. I mean, but this would be a very good study, though, is how did Graham use history, and how did historical figures inform his own self-image? What kind of dialogue did he have with the past to inform his image of himself? Yeah. Very good. Yeah. You're going to ask me a question? And you said, all right. Yeah.
No,
yeah,
I'm going to let us go to watch the Duke game. You know?
Watch the game, yeah.
Well, let's thank you, Dr. Wacker, again, for this talk.